I'm Bob Schwartz. I'm one of the leaders of the Pathways to Prosperity Network, and I'm a faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Joe Fuller is a professor of management practice at the Harvard Business School. We've collaborated on a project across our two schools to really try to focus attention on the middle skills gap. Joe comes with a history as one of the founders and leaders of the Monitor Group, one of the nation's leading consulting groups, really an international group. He's the reason we kind of joined forces is that Joe's been one of the leaders of a major initiative at the Harvard Business School focused on the private sector's role in increasing U.S. competitiveness. And that work connected to the work that I and my colleagues at Jobs for the Future have been doing around trying to build a network of states and regions to address a lot of the issues that Nick put on the table. I'm going to begin by asking Joe to say a couple of words about the Competitiveness Project, and in particular, the Middle Skills Initiative that he's been leading. Then I really want to focus the discussion. We only have a few minutes, but I want to pick up particularly on one part of Nick's comments. And that's really the question of how we can get the education system and the employer community to work more effectively together, particularly what I would argue is kind of at the prevention end of the continuum. That is, catching kids while they're still in school, socializing them to the world of work early, making sure that the curriculum and opportunities for young people are kind of co-designed with employers and educators, and trying to make sure that all young people leave high school with much more knowledge and understanding of the world of work, the world of careers, and the intersection between their own interests and strengths, what kinds of opportunities are really out there for them, and then being able to make informed choices about the education and training paths that can get them started, whether it's a 4-year institution, a 2-year institution, 1-year certificate program, certification program. I think in this economy, the big message is everybody's going to need something beyond a high school education to really get launched in this career. And everybody is going to need to know and learn much more about the world of careers while they're still in high school. But Joe, let me start with you and ask you to say a few things about your work.
Well, thank you, Bob, and I thank you for inviting me. Although I can't say that I'm particularly grateful for following Monty and Dion and Miss Joseph and Nick. I feel a little bit like one of those punchlines from Hollywood, don't act with kids and animals. Well, I'm definitely, on stage after some great...
The kids were already up here. What is he talking about?
Some great presenters. So as Bob said, we've, for the last 5 years at Harvard Business School, had a long-term program to understand American competitiveness, and one of the first issues that we identified was the skills gap. We surveyed all our alumni it's the biggest single alumni body at Harvard other than people who went to college, and they identified a number of issues that they felt where America had historically had a strength, but where that strength was ebbing. And some of those areas really don't fit with our mandate at Harvard Business School. They were things like tax policy and the legal code and whatnot. And if we start talking about the legal code, the law school guys get upset. If we start talking about tax policy, the government school gets upset. So we just stuck to the things that really had resonance with business. And not knowing anything about the topic, I got interested in the skills issue. And if I'd known then what I know now, I would have bitten off something easy like curing cancer or, world hunger, because this is one of the most complex, impacted issues that I've ever looked at. And I'll just give you a couple of quick conclusions. I think we can view skills as a marketplace. There's demand from employers like Nick, and there's supply, aspiring workers, most of whom are coming out of some kind of educational environment. And I think Nick's term was goofed up. This is the most goofed up, inefficient market you ever saw in your life. And why is it goofed up? The first is that there's really lousy information flow. So companies aren't good at defining what they need. They're not good at communicating that to the marketplace and educators. And that's probably okay because a lot of educators and workforce intermediaries don't really listen very attentively anyhow. And the second reason it's goofed up is we get all these rifle shot, kind of laser beam interventions from policymakers to solve very specific problems when they're not really addressing the real problem, which is we need to get employers and educators and workforce intermediaries, we need to remove the barriers for them to work together to give aspiring workers, particularly young people, the opportunities to develop skills and interests that are going to be the formation, the basis for household formation, which is, that's, to me, that's often the gold standard. If we are getting more young people on a path for successful, timely household formation, then we know we're doing something good and meaningful. So, as Nick suggested, this is not just an issue, a societal issue, this is a competitiveness issue. Because one of the most disturbing things in my research is that if you survey employers, more and more, because of the absence of skilled workers, they are making decisions to get work done in a different way by investing in technology, by offshoring work, or just outsourcing it to somebody else who may be in Sheboygan or maybe in Shanghai, but the employer says it's just too much of a hassle to find people that can do this work. I'm going to make it somebody else's problem. And consistently in the data that I've been assembling, you see a very, very frightening thing, which is that hiring a new full-time employee for a lot of employers is getting to be the solution of the last resort. I would rather invest in technology than have to go find someone. I'd rather make it somebody else's problem than go hire someone. And if, for whatever reason, the absence of skills, regulation, policy decisions, when we make employers pull every lever they can before they put up that want ad, we're on the wrong path. So, Bob, let me turn it back to you.
Yeah. First, Nick, thank you very much for an inspiring talk. I think you put some issues on the table. You particularly created a sense of urgency that I think virtually everybody in this room feels, and I think you push us to say, how serious are we willing to make this the number one issue? Yesterday, in the middle of the day, we had a really interesting discussion about the skills gap between two economists, Paul Osterman and Harry Holzer. Harry made a comment that, on this question of do we really have a gap? Well, Harry pointed out something that we've been saying as well, which is that the reality is if you look at the 25-year-old population in the US, well below half of that population actually have skills and credentials that have value in the labor market. If you don't simply add up look at the attainment numbers, but if you actually ask about degrees of value in the labor market, we now know that nearly half of the young graduates with four-year degrees are really struggling in this labor market. And to kind of amplify, one of your comments, the reality is that we now have pretty solid evidence that in half a dozen states, at least, where there have been analyses, you can see that those with two-year technical degrees aligned with the regional labor market, even 10 years after graduation, are out-earning average BA holders. I wanted to, I've had the opportunity, as an education person, as you have as an employer, to really look at vocational systems around the world, not just at the US. And one of the things that's most striking to me in the high-performing systems in high-performing economies is the role that employers play. They don't simply sit back and wait to see what the education system is going to produce. They get in at the front end and really collaborate in setting the standards and basically form a kind of partnership with the education community to make sure that there is real alignment. And I just wanted to come back to you and ask, what ideas do you have about how we might be, over time, be able to build that kind of culture in the employer community here?
Look, it ain't that complicated.
it's like this. You know, one of the things, remember when I said we have 65,000 SKUs, so one of the things about Snap-on is it's a hopelessly complex organization. So what you learn pretty quickly is you have to make big strokes and say, okay, follow this envelope. And my suggestion is one of the things that's been missing is actually compelling ourselves as a movement to actually try to sell, to try to enlist people in it as opposed to logic them in it. So let me give you some examples. For example, schools. Booker T. Washington, in his book Up From Slavery, he said that, you know, kids, young Afro-American kids were being educated in Latin and Greek instead of things they could do, you know, practically. Mene nedea pleadio be Achille, the first line of the Iliad. I can recite it in Greek, but that in a 25 cents will get me a pack of gum. You know, it doesn't help me today. And so I think we have to appeal to education people to say, you're not creating careers, you're creating education, and we need to sell them on that. We need to sell employers on the idea that this is a white hat issue. You may not know what I mean by white hat issue, but I'll tell you this. Here's the thing business is sensitive to. Nobody's listening. If you think people are pejorative about any other character or group of people in the United States, read the newspaper about big business, for example. When I was a boy, we used to think that what was good for General Motors is good for America. People don't so much believe that anymore. So I would suggest that if business wants to influence public policy, they adopt a white hat issue, and this is a white hat issue which they can get behind and be seen not to be self-serving in a way that, say, corporate tax would be self-serving. So I think that's an easy way to sell them to get involved. Because I think business is willing to do this if you appeal to them on that level, as opposed to advocating everything that might be commercially favorable as an essential task. And then finally, for the nation as a whole, I think this works pretty well. This is an issue which says it's not about how we allocate prosperity, how we divvy up prosperity. It's an issue about whether we will have prosperity or not. We don't solve this, we won't have prosperity. It's not about fixing our weaknesses, it's about advocating and using our strengths, what has always been our strength. And so I think these may not be the right things to use, but I suggest it has to do with selling and enlisting as opposed to logicking people into it. It can't just be the P&L.
Right.
It can't just be the P&L, because the P&L, companies have so many varying issues around P&Ls. You know, Joe just talked about it. There are so many issues around this that you can't deal with them all. It's like a hydra, right? But I think if you have these kinds of broader ways to go, then you have a movement which convinces people that we should move in this direction. I believe lots of progress can be made. If the President of the United States got on TV and said, this is a national calling, that would change a lot.
Let me come back to the, I agree, we need to figure out a way to really message this as a win-win kind of situation. One of the issues I know that Joe has been focused on is trying to, how do we engage employers in ways that help them understand that engaging with education early on is really in their long-term economic self-interest. A lot of companies that do come to the table come principally out of the kind of corporate social responsibility, good citizenship motivation. In my experience, altruism is a pretty thin reed on which to really build a system. And I wondered, Joe, if you'd kind of comment on that from the work that you've been doing with companies.
Well, I think that I agree with Nick that elevating this issue and discussing it in fundamental principle terms is fundamental to getting people to think differently about it, employers to think differently about it. I also think that most employers have a very limited and I'm going to say defective understanding of how the skills gap affects their economics. And that we can engage people on the basis of enlightened self-interest. We can say to employers they can do what's good for their community and what's good for average citizens and what's good for the country, because shared prosperity is absolutely integral to our harmony as a society, but also that they need to understand that just going out and playing the spot market for labor is a bad economic decision. That when you understand the total cost of not being able to find someone, of hiring someone who ultimately doesn't have the skills, whether they're hard skills or soft skills, a term I don't like very much, but we all know what I mean by that. When that worker fails, the cost of that failed hire is several times that person's salary in terms of direct cost of hiring somebody else, lost productivity, overtime for other workers, whatnot. And if we can link these two arguments, that this is doing good by doing well, to do good and do well at the same time. Do good for our country, but do well for yourself, well for your organization, making your organization more robust, make it more competitive, make it most effective. And causing them to understand, employers to understand that means thinking about educators much more like they think about normal, everyday suppliers. That they buy steel, that they buy plastics, that they buy Snap-on tools, that they evaluate those vendors, that they provide data to those vendors, they partner with those vendors, they invest in those vendors' success. I bet you when Nick's purchasing department detects a long-standing supplier is shipping product to Snap-on that's not up to grade, they don't throw up their hands and curse politicians, which is what you do when there's no talent available as an employer. What they do is somebody that works for Nick goes to that supplier and says, we got to figure out what's going on here. We need you to get back on standard. And that type of supply chain logic, absolutely embracing what Madi said about this is about people, so we can't just act like people are widgets. But the type of process discipline, data exchange, tracking of effectiveness that is implicit in that kind of supply chain logic is the way to get to a completely different level of productivity in this goofed up market that I talked about. And by the way, many of you are people that are training those workers, and that means as that supplier, you have to not just be responsive to those employers, because they got the currency that counts for you. They've got jobs. They got, as Steve said, Nick said, 5.8 million open job postings in the United States right now, despite an epically low workforce participation rate, which is the actual scary number out there. So, 5.8 million jobs. Why are they open? In part because we're not providing people who've got those skills. As someone who inculcates skills in people, you all need to be not just responsive to those signals, you got to be asking for them. You got to be going to employers and say, help me be a good supplier. Help me understand why you're not hiring my kids for those jobs. Because we're training them up in areas that we think are responsive to your needs, but you're not hiring them. Why? Just tell me. Tell me what's defective about that product so I can give you the type of product you want to buy.
Nick, you wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, look, I agree with everything you said, but let me just give you this. Snap-on, we come to this naturally, as I said, because we are rooted in the pride and dignity of work truly. We wouldn't have a business if people didn't have that pride and dignity associated with our tools. But we are more involved with this because of Brian Albrecht, the president of Gateway Community College, who has been a tremendous interlocutor on this and influenced us about how our thought is. And if he didn't have the vision to see that and inform us on this, Kathy Manis, who's an officer of this organization, who helped us here, Eric Selzner out of the government, who has given us some ideas about this. One thing I do disagree with you. I don't think this is about money. I don't think it's so much about metrics. I got the 5.8 from you, by the way. I read that you wrote 5.8. Right. Anyway,
shoot, I made that up.
Anybody can, when you depend on the Harvard Education School, you can always be right. But I don't think it's really so much about money. The big, I think, obstacle is the attitudes. If you say to me, people are educators, and they're not worried about the jobs their people are getting, their curriculum are not creating jobs, or not creating careers, then what are they doing? You know, are we teaching Latin and Greek, the Latin and Greek of Booker T. Washington, which I have to say enhanced my life. I love it, you know, but it didn't put food on the table. It hasn't kept my family warm and safe and dry. And so I think it has to do with attitudinal things before what you're talking about. I do think education institutions and upskilling have to be embracing of business to say, here, this will help you. Mm-hmm. And then business has to recognize, I come back to my idea, the historic opportunity they have to reclaim their image. Right. And do something for the country, because a corporation is a commercial organism by which that represents the interests of not only the shareholders, but the employees and the communities and all the stakeholders that surround us. If you're not doing that in your corporation, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And I think companies can be convinced of that if people like Brian Albrecht and Kathy Manis approach them.
Last question for me, because I know we're close to running out of time here. You made a really important point in distinguishing between the companies of your size that can do this internally versus, you know, the mass, I mean, the backbone of the U.S. economy, small and medium-sized employers. We can't get there, in my view, company by company. We've got to figure out ways to really mobilize companies by sector and figure out the kind of structures and supports that needed. Will you say a few words, Nick, about that? I mean, how do you think about the role of industry associations and organizations, you know, by sector to work with educators to narrow this gap?
I think they have a role that can help with educators and can help with companies, particularly with the companies. Because if you're in the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable or the National Association of Manufacturers, which we're part of, your relationship, I think, is your best with your memberships. And so you can do that. Like there's something called the Manufacturing Institute with the National Association of Manufacturing, which focuses on this. I believe, with respect to all those organizations, there are they have limited purchase with government and education. That's what I think. Because in my view, the Chamber of Commerce never saw a commercially leaning initiative that it didn't characterize as essential. So in other words, therein lies my point. Is this the most seminal issue of our time or not? So you need, I think, the more narrow the organization, the more it can do it. So I actually think they have less value in this situation because they're so involved in trying to represent the broad group inside their business. I think less so, myself. I suppose that's not the answer you wanted to hear, but
well, no,
but I think I don't think they want to focus on this. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was going to differentiate between these broad-based chambers and the more narrow sector associations where companies are really feeling the pain around this question of where are we going to get the workforce that we need.
You're absolutely right. The more narrow the organization, the better it can be, because it doesn't represent as wide a constituency. Right. If you're the Chamber of Commerce, you're representing, the importing of spotted owls and the TPP and everything else. I mean, you have to represent everything.
Joe, I want to give you the last word on this panel before we head into break.
I think that we see in a different version of what Nick was just talking about in communities. One of the things that is very puzzling to me is that despite the universality of this problem, there are all these, it's a classic 1,000 points of light phenomena. There are good things happening in various cities, in certain states, and that's because in a Chattanooga, Tennessee, there are a lot of decision makers who have made this an area of focus. And because it's more defined set of issues, of employers, of educators, it's more focused, if Nick was saying, you can get the right type of attention. But if there's one final thing I'd just like to say here is the way, I think, to get the hearts and minds of business decision makers and maybe even political decision makers is to shift the frame of the conversation. If you listen to TV, if you listen to politicians, and of course the most authoritative commentators on all things economic and political, Hollywood entertainers, who are their opinions are endlessly broadcast about issues like this. We've just got to get off this hobby horse that the only way to succeed in America is to get a 4-year degree. It completely distorts the conversation. The semi-informed, well-meaning, highly intelligent, powerful people in the United States start by asking the wrong question, which is, how can we get everyone to go to college? You can't. There wouldn't be the capacity if we had a Kennedy-like moonshot mandate to increase 4-year college enrollment. You might go from 32% at the current level to 40% in 20 years if you tried. We have to have the conversation around post-secondary credentials, degrees, certificates for everybody. And rather than putting disproportionate attention around removing any barriers to 4-year college matriculation, we have to refocus the debate on removing the barriers to getting relevant post-secondary experiences and credentials and degrees that lead to employment, that lead to household formation. And all of you get listened to on this issue of education. And while we want to celebrate people who go on to that higher level degree, we don't want to bury the headline, which is that 2/3 of our kids are never going to do it. And what we have to do as a society is give them a fair shot at success. And that means removing barriers to some type of relevant post-secondary attainment.
I just have one last point, though, is that is a slightly slippery slope. To the extent the upskilling of the American workforce cannot be characterized, in my opinion, as the salvation for the disadvantaged. Because if it is, then it will be forever the consolation prize.
Yep.
And so that, again, comes back to the idea of communication. Now, let me just say, though, I think you guys made a collective point that's very great. In other words, the narrower it is, the better it is. And I would suggest it's not industry. It's, as Joe said, location. Yeah. Because that's what the Metro Revolution, Jennifer Bradley's book, is all about. The Metro, and actually, as I look at it, in my experience, around Wichita, around Kenosha, around a bunch of different places in Texas, it's done that. James Fallows had a great article in Atlantic Monthly about this. And so I think by location, the narrowing of interest by location is a way to do this. You fit on something really good.
On that note, okay. Teresa, do we turn it back to you to close this out?
Okay.
But let me thank Nick and Joe especially.